Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms, presented by Diligent Institute, your source for the latest and greatest in corporate governance, all in 10 minutes. I'm Lisa Edwards, Executive Chair of the Diligent Institute, and I'm your host for today's discussion. I'm joined by Paul DeNicola, a principal at PwC's Governance Insight Center. Paul, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, Lisa.
It's great to have you here. I'm really excited to talk to you today about the findings of the annual Corporate Directors Survey. This is always a highly anticipated report here at Diligent Institute and elsewhere around the governance world. So maybe give us a quick overview of the report for those listeners who may not be familiar with it.
Sure. So for over 15 years, PwC's annual Corporate Directors Survey has taken the pulse of the corporate boardroom. And this year's survey was of over 600 public company directors. And it really suggested that the pace that directors are evolving to meet some of these challenges remains slow. And so the resistance to evolution continues to be an issue for many boards, particularly when it requires self-reflection about their own composition. And so while it's more important than ever that boards have the right people, some directors remain reluctant to take action on the issue of board refreshment. And though directors tell us they're ready to handle things like enhanced disclosure in areas like sustainability, there's also a growing hesitancy when it comes to seeing the link between ESG factors and company strategy and performance. But the news is not all grim, though. Directors' views on shareholder engagement have evolved. Their confidence in more technical topics like cybersecurity has grown, and they've clearly made strides when it comes to diversifying the boardroom, though it does remain a work in progress. But boards still have work to do responding to the imperative for change, and the imperative for change is the theme of this year's survey.
Yeah, interesting. So maybe let's dig into one of those headlines that you mentioned first, which is the statistic that was really interesting and kind of jumped out. About 45% of directors think that one of their board members should potentially be replaced. So tell us about that stat and maybe like a little bit, has that changed over time? Is that different than what you used to see in the past? And what does that actually mean in terms of board refreshment?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is that it hasn't changed over time. So if we've been asking this question for over 10 years, and it's always been sort of between 45 and 49% of board members who express that view. I think the takeaway is that board members are critical of their peers, but at the same time, they're not really using the board assessment process to drive change. The view that they have expressed on dissatisfaction with peer performance hasn't necessarily translated into changes in board composition. The board assessment process, right, which should identify performance issues theoretically, right, and in our view is probably not being leveraged to its full capabilities. In fact, we asked a question and only 11% of board members said their board assessment process resulted in the decision not to renominate a director. So what does the environment look like? Well, I mean, from a board composition standpoint, you have annual turnover rates at boards in the S&P 500. They're about 7% last year. You have rule-based refreshment mechanisms that have proven not particularly effective. While mandatory retirement age is common, over half of boards set that retirement age at 75 or older, and only 7% of S&P 500 companies have term limits. So in our research, when we asked directors about what the issues are, they pointed to either an ineffective board assessment process or board leadership's unwillingness to initiate difficult discussions about stepping down, as two is the biggest stumbling blocks to board refreshment. One other thing I'll add, we also found that the board leadership structure that a board chooses may impact refreshment. So by that, directors who are on boards with non-executive chairs are actually more likely to say their board made a change as a result of the assessment compared with their peers whose boards have combined CEO chairs.
Interesting. And has any of that tweaked a little bit because of universal proxy, or is that not coming into play yet?
I think it's probably still too early to say on universal proxy, but that's certainly something we're going to continue to watch.
Interesting. So another theme that we kind of saw coming together in the last year or so, especially in the United States, has been this, notion of backlash on ESG and some pulling back on some of at least talking about ESG. How's that translating into how directors are thinking about it according to the survey results?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with a little bit of the data and then give you some context on that. So in our survey this year, more directors now say that they're prepared to oversee forthcoming ESG disclosure. But at the same time, only half of board members see the link between ESG and company strategy. So on the issue of disclosure, so just over half of board members say their board is sufficiently prepared to oversee those disclosures, but that's up from 25% in 2022. All right, so clearly a lot of progress has been made there. But as I said, even fewer board members feel that these ESGs are linked to strategy. So in 2021, it was nearly 2/3, and this year it was just a little bit more than half. So you actually see that declining. And I guess your question on the context is what's driving this. So, stepping back, the impact of any ESG topic on a company is going to vary greatly dependent on its size, its geographic footprint, its industry, and other factors. But the risks and the opportunities are real, and board members play a key role in challenging their management teams to think creatively about strategic alternatives and the opportunities available after they prioritize which of those ESG topics are in fact linked to the company's strategy. But at the same time, to your ESG backlash point, some stakeholders like state governments, investors, activists have really pushed back on a perceived ESG agenda. So, for example, in 2023, you had 21 state attorney generals who sent letters to a handful of investors citing real concerns about the weight placed on ESG factors in the proxy voting process. So I can see for boards and management teams how it may be easy to lose the connection to strategy if you're viewing ESG through the lens of an agenda item on a discrete set of topics instead of a way to understand overall emerging market forces. Two other quick pieces on the ESG survey findings that I found interesting. One is on climate. So directors said their boards are actually discussing climate change this year less than last year, which was a big surprise to me, especially considering the proposed SEC climate rules and their potential impact. And then the other thing I found interesting was that within our corporate director survey, we're able to do splits by a number of different strata, but we looked particularly at the gender split. And on ESG issues, there's most definitely a gender difference or a gender disconnect. Female directors are far more likely to see ESG issues as linked to company strategy and having a financial impact on company performance as compared to their male counterparts.
Interesting. I did not realize that data. That would be worth digging more into and really understanding. I think one of the things that we have talked about on the webcast before about is, the notion of ESG is different for every company. And, I may say ESG and be talking about climate. You may say ESG and be talking about diversity. So that was another thing we saw in the findings that I thought was sort of interesting. If we think back to 2020, we saw this huge swing in support of expanding diversity in the workplace and in the boardroom in particular. So now we're 2023. How are directors thinking about boardroom diversity in 2023?
Yeah, 2023 boardroom views of diversity have clearly evolved. I think if I look at the headline from the survey, it is that directors clearly see the value in board diversity, but feel that the issue has become politicized. That's the key takeaway. Most directors, when we ask them, agree that diversity brings unique perspectives to the boardroom, enhances board performance, but at the same time, more than half believe that those diversity efforts are driven by political correctness, and about a third suggest that diversity efforts eventually put less qualified candidates on the board, which was something I found a little disturbing. There's also that, much like ESG issues, there's a gender divide. on the importance of board diversity. So while every female director surveyed this year views gender diversity as important for boards, a record low percentage of male directors agreed with that, only 73%. Since we've been conducting the survey, it was in the high 90s in 2020 and 21. Similarly, the percentage of male board members who think board diversity enhances board performance was also a record low. In 2019, it was 85%. This year, it was 76%. So a considerable drop in just a couple of years.
Yeah, that is actually an interesting swing back. We'll have to stay tuned for next year, I guess, and see if the trend continues or if it stabilizes out. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Although we could certainly spend multiple episodes digging into this content. It's really fascinating, and I know will be super interesting to everyone on boards. Thank you, Paul, for giving us all these great highlights. And if you want to read the full report, please go to check out PwC's Governance Insight Center website. It'll be up there, and you can read the whole thing. It should be a great read. We'll be back next week with another episode of Inside Today's Boardrooms. Thank you so much for listening.